So, first of all, welcome everybody. It's nearly Shabbat on the Hill again, and it's my enormous pleasure to welcome somebody that probably you all know. I think
I don't think so.
Pardon?
I don't think so. Some do, some don't.
Okay. I've known Steve Miller for 30 years or thereabouts. He's made a life in the community. He was one of the founders of SEDEC. He was one of the founders of Limud. He's a teacher. He's a facilitator. He's a spiritual person. He's a member of two synagogues, the one that he goes to and the one that he goes to. And he's known to many people at Muswell Hill. And this evening, he's going to be talking about Jewish revolutionaries. And with that, I'm just going to hand over and say, thank you, Steve, for talking to us this evening.
Okay, it's lovely to do this. And you'll find out in a second, this is the kind of talk which I never thought I would actually repeat, because it was a kind of a time constrained session. So it's lovely to do it again. And I hope the Muswell Hillians will also welcome one or two of my other friends who have dropped in. So if there's one or two names that you don't recognize on the screen, they might be my mates from other places. I will be using PowerPoint slides, so you have the choice, you can control, but I have shared my screen. So what you can do, if you toggle your screen, you can see my big Russian socialist revolutionary poster. I think that will give you the best benefit. You can toggle back to me talking if you want to watch me talking, and that's entirely up to you. So, without further ado, this came about because in 2017, in the summer of 2017, when I was thinking about what sessions I would offer to Limud that year in December, I made an assumption. I wrote to them and said, because I always have lots of things mulling around my brain, and I said, yeah, how many sessions have you got on the Russian Revolution? Assuming that there would be some serious historian or politician or somebody doing something. And they came back and said none. And that seemed to me to be a crying shame. So in the end, we put together two sessions for those, and I will say this is being very, maybe arrogant, I don't know. The other session was an extraordinary session. We put together a session in which I could publicly argue with my son in front of a room of 100 people. And we've never had so much fun at Limud. That one, never to be repeated. We were arguing about which was more important, the Balfour Declaration or the Russian Revolution. It was a live event, never to be repeated, as I say. But this was my second one. I thought it might be interesting. We often have sessions, I think we often have sessions about famous Jewish figures of the past. And I thought, well, we know, or we half know. If I was to do Trotsky, there would be some Trotsky experts. And clearly I'm not a Trotsky expert. Try saying that very quickly. So I thought, let's look at some lesser known Jewish revolutionaries. And I started digging around, and I was looking for people who, first of all, had an interesting story. There's no point if they haven't got an interesting story. Secondly, that they were active at the time of the 1917 revolutions. There were people who became figures later, who might have been figures earlier, but I wanted them to be around in Russia at the time of the 1917 revolutions, and that there was some kind of primary evidence that I could dig out. So in other words, I would be showing you more than you could just find on Wikipedia. Although, yeah, you can find a lot on Wikipedia, but I wanted to find a little bit more. So there had to be something more to it, and that they would be women as well as men. Those are my criteria. I've got 5, and you'll see. So I think in my blurb, which I haven't quite got in front of me, I said romantics, heroes, villains, ideologues, artists, and victims, I may have said. So you can make your judgment about which of any of these are any of those categories. We'll start off, I'm going to move on from the poster in a moment, but this is a poster of the Socialist Revolutionary Party in the elections in 1917. Slogan is Socialist Revolutionary Party, only in battle will you obtain your rights. And we'll find out a little bit more about the Socialist Revolutionary Party quite soon. The last introductory point I want to make before I get to my people is it's just a thought about why this might still be relevant. It's not just a historical, of historical interest. So very quickly, 2003, fairly recent, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, before he died, his last major book called 200 Years Together, he discusses aspects of Jews in Russia. And he, I haven't got time to give you the whole quotes, but he basically implies, first of all, that the Jews brought the pogroms on themselves. And then he repeated the sort of Jewish Bolshevism theory, because remember, by the time in the 21st century, Bolshevism is all bad, and if the Jews were kind of tied up with it. He said, where the camps where I was kept, the Jews whose experience I saw, their life was softer than the others. That's just his attitude. And so that attitude, this is still around. Vladimir Putin, 2013, even more recent. The donation of the Schneerson Library back to the Jewish community. The Schneerson Library had been nationalized in the very early days of the revolution. And he's musing, he's there at the presentation. And he says, first of all, the decision to nationalize this library, which remember, that's a bad thing. The decision to nationalize this library was made by the first Soviet government, whose composition was 80 to 85% Jewish, he says. And he went on to say that all the politicians on this predominantly Jewish Soviet government were guided by false ideological considerations and supported the arrest and repression of Jews, Russian Orthodox Christians, Muslims, and members of other faiths. In other words, it was the Jews who did it to themselves. And my final contemporary point, 2017, Bishop Shevkunov, you think that we've done the Romanovs, but in 2017, they had another commission into the execution of the Romanov family. Bishop Shevkunov, who is the chair of the commission, suggests that the execution of the Romanov family was a ritual murder. We all know what ritual murder is code for, and he was very clear that's what he was saying. My very last point before we go on to the people, and I'll move on now. Okay, we've got some real revolutionaries here. This is an early Council of People's Commissars. How many? Right. So this is. If I was in a room, I would ask you to tell me. But maybe if people, do you know you can temporarily unmute yourself just by pressing the space button. So I'm going to ask, how many of that Council of People's Commissars do you think are Jewish? Anybody who wants to unmute themselves very quickly and then back to mute? Is anybody? Either nobody's answering or they're not working the tech because you've muted everybody.
You have to
8.
hold the spacebar down.
No, it's,
I can see Mark and Lydia, and I can see
8.
Brush.
8, Wigger. I'm going for 8.
8. Okay.
I'm going for a minion. 10.
You're going for a minion. Any advances?
I think 1.
Bracha wins the prize for today. Of this Council of People's Commissars, just one. And this is an early picture. You can look very carefully for Leon Trotsky. He's not there. He appeared slightly later on the scene in terms of these group photos. But there is one other commissar, Isaac Steinberg, who was a member of this Socialist Revolutionary Party, which we'll keep coming back to that. He was the Commissar of Justice, and he's on the far left. So I don't know if I'm pointing to the far left on my screen. Here's the guy on the far left. And I could give you another list of the, this particular council didn't last very long, but the next council, which we don't have, this is a very well-known photo. We don't have a photo of, but say similar number of people. One in the next council, one Jew for certain, Leon Trotsky, one who might be because he happened to come from Poland, and that's it. So one, maybe 2 Jews. So yeah, we had this stuff going around that there were all these Jews. There were about 900 Jews who were members of the Bolshevik Party. And then there were many more when it became the thing to become a member. So I just want you to sort of have this in the back of your mind. The Jews were not running the Bolshevik Party at the time. It's a kind of a myth that has arisen, but there were lots of Jews around, and we're going to see a few. So, number 1, Ossip Piatnitsky. So he's my first romantic. I picture him as a bit of a kind of Muswell Hill romantic. And he's definitely, so you can also make judgments about how Jewish these people are or not. He's definitely Jewish. What's the documentary evidence? When I say Jewish, I mean Jewish. You know, somebody who talks about their Judaism, and who says, and you're going to hear in a second, who tells us how important it was to him. He grew up in a middle-class-ish Jewish family in a remote provincial town. Now, the documentary primary evidence that we have for him is his own memoir. So a memoir, an autobiography, is not necessarily objective fact. We know that. But it's written in 1925. So he's looking back. He could write anything about his childhood, but you'll hear what he actually does write about his childhood, particularly at a period in 1925 when the Jews were already suffering oppression of various kinds within the Soviet Union. So he says, I was born in a well-to-do Jewish family. My family was one of the first pioneers of Russian Enlightenment amongst the Jews in our city. That means he introduced Russian speech into his family and Russian books. And then he talks about, he goes on, he talks about his experience in Cheder. And he talks about teacher. He describes the person as teacher. Teacher, although considered among the Jews uneducated, not a Talmudist, because he's a Cheder teacher, and they kind of look down on the Cheder teachers. If he was a proper, educated scholar, he'd be teaching yeshiva, but he's not. He's a Cheder teacher. But as a teacher, he was undoubtedly in his place. He loved his pupils, and this is the most important thing. The little that he knew, he skillfully and lovingly passed on to his pets. And he talks about the impression that the stories, the biblical stories made on him. The legend of Joseph the Beautiful made a strong impression on me. The first time I began to dream, I will be as merciful and kind as Joseph. I love the story of Joseph with all my heart. as the study of the Bible progressed, another image, colossal, enchanting, conquering me, replaced the image of Joseph. Who was it? I'm not going to keep, because it's going to be too different. It was Moses, a warrior, a lawgiver. In my childhood imagination, he was pictured as big, almost to the very sky, omnipotent, terrible. I was afraid of him and I worshipped him. He then talks about moving on to the yeshiva and hating it. He hated it. He hated the teacher. He hated what he was learning. Luckily, he says, fortunately, I was saved by a rich library in ancient Hebrew. I pounced on reading it and found there for myself a lot that attracted me. Who was his next hero? I was absolutely alive, he says. The History of the Jewish Wars by Josephus made a particularly powerful impression on me, and this heroic struggle for the liberation of the Maccabees and then the gigantic fighter, Bar Kokhba. These were the people who captured me. I dreamed passionately, dreamed when I became big, I would follow in the footsteps of Bar Kokhba. We're going to leave his childhood there because I need to move on. He, with his ideals, with his influence from those biblical stories, he first of all went to medical school, but then dropped out because he joined with the progressively political students in the 1870s. He joined an organization called To the People, which was literally what it sounds like. We should work and organize in the people, with the people. He left the academy and he went to the people. And he writes, still in his memoir, before me stood some very special difficulties for me, for I'm a Jew. I was embarrassed by this circumstance. How will the people react? And comrades reassured me that actually the Russian people are very tolerant. And because I don't look very Jewish, they won't know. That was basically the story. So he worked for a carpenter. He was useless at that. He worked as a porter in a hospital. He was useless at that. In the end, he was arrested in 1880 and he was exiled in Munich. He completed his medical training, came back in 1917, but he lived as a quiet, this is my, I'm projecting my impression of him as a quiet, romantic revolutionary. He wasn't going to be a party organizer, but he worked in the historical and revolutionary archives, lived a very quiet life, and died in 1926 in Moscow. Okay. I don't know if I have time to pause for any questions. Whoop. Any quick questions? No, I'm gonna move on because there's a lot more people. Okay, this one you might know. I'm going to ask you, does anybody know who this is?
No.
No. Thundering silence. You might know when I tell you. Sorry?
Is she the poet?
No. No. Good try. Who was that? Simon. Good try. This is her married name. If I tell you that her birth name was Olga Bronstein, does that help you? Thundering silence. I'm not good on.
Sister.
Sorry?
Trotsky's sister.
Trotsky's sister. She is Leon Trotsky's baby sister. And the primary evidence we have for her is Trotsky's writings, because he wrote a lot. She didn't really. We don't know. We haven't got it. He wrote a lot. So he describes their childhood. So it's him writing, but it's their shared childhood, living in a tiny village in Ukraine. Trotsky writes, my father and mother lived out their hard-working lives with some friction, but very happily on the whole. Of the 8 children born of this marriage, 4 survived. I was 5th in order of birth. So Leon was 5th in order of birth. Olga is the younger sister. He says, describes the sort of life there, the land, the cattle, the poultry, the mill. Took all of my parents' time. There was none left for us. We lived in a little mud house. The straw roof harboured countless sparrows' nests under the eaves, and the walls and the outsides were seamed with deep cracks, which were a breeding place for adders. The low ceilings leaked during a heavy rain. The rooms were small, the windows dim, the floors in the 2 rooms and the nursery were of clay and bred fleas. Trotsky, Leon, was very close to his baby sister. We usually sat in the dining room in the evening till we fell asleep. Sometimes a chance word of one of the elders would waken some special reminiscence in us. Then I would wink at my little sister. She would give a low giggle, and the grown-ups would look absent-mindedly at her. I would wink again. She would try to stifle her laughter and would hit her head against the table. If our laughter became too uncontrollable, I was obliged to slip under the table and crawl among the feet of the grown-ups. Once back in the dining room, it would all begin all over again. My fingers would grow so weak from laughing that I could not hold a glass. My head, my lips, my hands, my feet, every inch of me would be shaking with laughter. This is the founder of the Red Army. But clearly very affectionate, very close to Olga. Leon joined the Social Democratic Labour Party and Olga followed him. And she met a member of the Social Democratic Labour Party, Lev Kamenev, and they married fairly soon, fairly young. Kamenev was arrested, and then the Kamenevs left Russia when he was released, left Russia for Geneva, and then they came back in 1914. And Kamenev was a senior Bolshevik official from 1914 to the revolution and afterwards. So she was the wife of one and the sister of another. Was she an ideologue? I don't know, but she was carried it through into the whole party machine. Olga was in charge of the theatres, and I think there's an interesting aside. She was. We're going to talk about art in a second, but there's an interesting aside. There's a whole period of artistic expression soon after the revolution. Hang on, here she is at her desk. There we go. Here she is being a Bolshevik bureaucrat. There's a period after the revolution in which creativity and new forms of art in every field was encouraged. But that was a very short-lived period. It's another whole lecture. I'm not going to have time, but she started off being part of that move to encourage. She was in charge of the theatre. She encouraged new forms of theatre. There were new forms of art. But as the Soviets took a view that these new forms of art were corrupt and were not properly of the people, she towed the party line. So she came back and she closed down a lot of the new theatre and new art. She also had a very tough personal life. It turned out that Lev Kamenev, who as a senior Bolshevik had lots of opportunities in both to London, where he met and he had an affair with a British artist. This artist, Claire Sheridan, came to visit Moscow, and we have her description of Olga, who she described as a little peasant maid with a yellow handkerchief tied over her head. And this then ensues, she says, an awkward moment of being shown to no room. They couldn't go anywhere. They were to be shown to a room in the hotel. Claire Sheridan. It was all very awkward. Not only that, but being a senior Bolshevik, Lev actually lost influence. He was with Trotsky. Kamenev and Trotsky defeated the Communist Party Congress, and in 1935 she was exiled from Moscow and Leningrad. Lev was executed in 1936. She was imprisoned. Her youngest son was executed at the age of 17. Her older son was executed in 1939, and she was executed in 1941, along with many, many other early Bolsheviks who were not part of Stalin's crowd. So she had done, so again, is she, you can judge, I'm not sure, she joined the club that her brother was in. She married a guy who was in that club. Was she an ideologue? I don't know. She towed the line all the way, and for all of her trouble, she was executed. It's a very, I think that is a tragic situation. We now come on to somebody who can only be described as a villain of the piece. So we like to think, do we not? Us Jews are pretty much nice folk. We're nice to people. Our first revolutionary, Ossip, he was a romantic. We're a bit like that. Olga, she was drawn into all of this. Not a bad person. Lazar was a bad person. There is no doubt about it. He was a bad person. He was born in 1893, also in Ukraine, near Kiev. His parents, they supplied livestock to the slaughterhouse. So that, I don't know if that puts them, lower middle class in village life. 4 brothers all became communists. He quickly, from 1907, he moved to Kiev. He worked in a shoe factory, scrapyard, various factories, and became involved in revolutionary activities and was a very successful organizer. In 1918, he was commissar of the propaganda, various senior committees of the Bolshevik and Communist Party. But once Stalin became the general secretary of the Communist Party, 1922, Kaganovich became his right-hand man. He was his hitman, his go-to doer of all evil. So if there was somebody who had to be denounced at a Communist Party Congress, he's your man. If in Red Square, what now is Red Square, the Cathedral of Christ the Saviour, I can't remember which one that is, in 1931, was dynamited. Who was the person who decided to dynamite the cathedral? Lazar Kaganovich. There is worse to come. I promise you there is worse to come. He said at the time, Mother Russia In other words, all that old stuff. Mother Russia is cast down. We have ripped away her skirts. And he is also the one who didn't invent the phrase, but in this context, he said, why wail over broken eggs when we are trying to make an omelette? He wrote that in an interview in Time magazine, American Time magazine in 1932. 1932 to 1933, have people heard of the Ukrainian famine? Millions died, partly you might say through natural circumstances, but overwhelmingly the story says because of the policies of the leadership, the Communist Party. When I gave this at Limud, and I said, he is known in the Ukraine. So I only read this. He is known in the Ukraine as the butcher of the Ukraine. At the back of the room, a young guy stood up and said, yes, this is what we're taught in schools in Ukraine. Lazar Kaganovich was the butcher of Ukraine. He is taught now as the evil master at that point in history. Stalin died in 1953, and Lazar lost influence. Oh, actually, I want you to hear. Oh, that's his lovely parents. Those are his lovely brothers. And just hear his lovely voice before I. Can you? I'm only going to give you a second. Okay. Now, what do you think would have happened to him? He was close to Stalin. Stalin left the stage. He died in 1953. He even tried to stage a coup against Khrushchev, who he had earlier on, he had mentored Khrushchev. And he was expelled from the party. Amazingly, nothing happened to him. Well, no, he was exiled, but he was not executed, which I think you would have assumed. He was the very last of the old Bolsheviks to die in 1991. He was still living till 1991. The old Bolsheviks were the members of the Bolshevik Party at the time of the 1917 revolution. He was the very last one to die. So I don't know what lesson we can draw from that. This evil man, we're going to move on. And he lived to old age. Bracha, what did you say?
Quickie, where was he exiled to? Siberia?
No, he just was, he had to, he was not, I haven't got it in this note. I've got it on another note somewhere. He couldn't live in the main city. He ended up running some kind of tiny factory in some out of the way place. He wasn't sent to a prison camp or anything. But he wasn't allowed to be in Moscow or Leningrad. The centers of power. He was thrown out. But he did apparently. After that point, after this failed coup in 1957, this evil man I'm telling you about, apparently, his family say that he changed completely and became a devoted grandpa. What can you say? I don't know.
Do you have any information about his Jewish influences?
Not very much. So he's Jewish, but not very. Unlike I said the first guy was Jewish. Lazar, not very Jewish. Okay. A light interlude. With most tragedies, or certainly Shakespearean tragedies, you've got a light interlude. You have a comedy scene or a comedy character. This isn't a comedy, but he is a light interlude before we come on to the real tragic denouement of the session. Natan Altman, very well-known artist. If people know the poet Ossip Mandelstam, he wrote this little poem about Altman. He says, "Here you have the painter Altman. He's a very ancient gent. In the German language, Altman means a very ancient gent. He's a painter of the old school, slogged until his back was bent. That's why he looks so gloomy, this so very ancient gent." Apparently, Mandelstam's friends knew this poem very well. They knew of Altman, born again in Ukraine. A lot of Ukrainians. This is Vinnytska, near Moldova, so that kind of southwest corner. So I'm going to move fairly quickly. After the revolution, so first, actually, during his artistic training, he brought Jewish motifs into his art. So he clearly saw himself as Jewish. And we'll find out a little bit more in a second. Fine arts in Petrograd, and he designed parades and monuments. This is where him and Olga Kameneva kind of overlap, because she organized some of these parades, including the first anniversary of the storming of the Winter Palace, and they created these huge fabric, what do you call them? You're not here. I need people quiet. Banners. Thank you. This is why I need people. Thank you, Lydia. He designed these banners for the first anniversary of the Revolutionary. I think they're quite stunning, actually. I'll show you some of his other work. This is a bust of Lenin. He worked in the theatre and created, interestingly, a stage design for the play The Dybbuk in 1922, which was preferred to Chagall's design. And this design for the Habima theatre company, when they moved to Israel, they still took his sets with them. Some more of his work. He left Russia, but then moved back in 1936, and he died in Leningrad. So this is the light relief I'm giving you before we come to, and some of his work is still in the local museum in Vinnytsia. I'm sure I'm pronouncing it wrong. We're now coming to the tragic end here, the tragic story. Fanny is clearly, in my mind, the tragic victim here. Her birth and childhood, lost in a bit of confusion. Even her name, sometimes she's called Dora, one of 7 children, definitely Jewish. She became a political revolutionary at an early age, and she joined the Socialist Revolutionary Party. Remember, I said we would come back to them. In 1906, when she was 16, she was arrested in Kiev over involvement in a terrorist bomb plot, and she was sent to some terrible prisons. She was beaten. She lost her sight, which was partially restored later. And in March 1917, after the February Revolution, she was released from prison. But there were these conflicts, these splitters. They were the splitters, or the Bolsheviks were. The Bolsheviks, there were elections in which the Socialist Revolutionary Party were elected as the majority in the Constituent Assembly. You saw how good their posters were. The Bolsheviks were not in the majority there, but they had power in the local Soviets, and the power there was amongst the working groups in the factories in Moscow and Leningrad. So there was this, and Lenin expelled all the members of the Social Revolutionary Party. Then on 30th of August 1918, something happened. I'm going to show you a film first, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the story. The film was made in 1939, but it's a propaganda film that is saying to its audience, the film is called Lenin in 1918. This is saying to its audience, this is what happened to our great leader, Lenin, in 1918. So, on to the film. So, Lenin is speaking at a factory. The great hero. Everyone just want to spend a moment with Lenin, except this evil person here. She runs away, but look, our hero is running after her, locking her up in an outhouse somewhere before our hero has to go back, because our hero has to come back and save Lenin. Is Lenin dead? Or is he alive? Our great leader of the revolution. Everybody is coming to our group. Make space. Give him room. Why? He's alive. So our hero gets Lenin into the car, to hospital. Right, now our hero has got Lenin safely away. What's the next job for the hero? Music change. Know who shot Lenin? What do we do with somebody who shoots Lenin? They're about to lynch her, except for our brave party members who believe in the rule of law. And the party is saving her from the lynch mob. Except, look, there's our hero again. Or somebody like him. Okay. Right, we're gonna move on to... So, she's an assassin or attempted assassin. What you see is the official version. Goes to the factory. As he leaves the building, Fanya Kaplan calls out to him, fires 3 shots, 1 bullet passes through his coat, and the other 2 strike him. 1 passing through his neck, and the other lodging in the... Possible. None of this is true. I mean, it was true that there was the assassination attempt. Fanny was part of a Socialist Revolutionary Party group who were trying to bring down Lenin. But could it have been her? She couldn't shoot. I mean, she had no training with a gun. There were other members of their group who had training with guns. She couldn't see very well. The eyewitnesses are very mixed up. First of all, they said she had an umbrella and a suitcase, which would have been difficult for her to escape. Oh yes, that's the other thing. She wasn't arrested at the factory. She was arrested, first of all, the policeman who arrested her said they arrested her near the factory, but a week later it turned out they arrested her in the center of Moscow. So she was arrested, and here's the only actual primary evidence we have, which is her confession. This is her confession. My name is Fanya Kaplan. Today I shot Lenin. I did it on my own. I will not say from whom I obtained my revolver. I will give no details. I had resolved to kill Lenin long ago. I consider him a traitor to the revolution. I was exiled for participating in an assassination attempt against a Tsarist official in Kiev. I spent 11 years in hard labor. After the revolution, I was freed. I favored the Constituent Assembly, and I'm still for it. That's the end of her story. When it became clear that she wouldn't implicate any other accomplices, she was executed on September the 3rd. That's just a month. That's just a few days, not a month, sorry. The assassination attempt was August the 30th. She was executed on September the 3rd. And that's all we know about her. But all the evidence suggests, here she is, all the evidence suggests it couldn't possibly have been her. So that's why I think she's a tragic victim. She's the end of my revolutionaries. I'm going to go back to that.